So far, we've discussed the paths to Sovietization of most of the nations of Eastern Europe. The two nations that we have not yet talked about, we are, as I'm sure you've now guessed, going to explore in today's episode. We've left talking about Yugoslavia and Albania until the end after the others, as their paths in the wake of the Second World War were quite different from other socialist states. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. Both Yugoslavia and Albania, unlike the other nations in Eastern Europe, were liberated from Axis occupation not through the decisive military support of the Red Army, but rather by means of local partisan forces, fighting a guerrilla-style war against their occupiers. Crucially, in both countries, these partisan groups often held widely disparate political ideas, and there was a great deal of infighting within the resistance movement. Let's start by talking about Yugoslavia. Literally translating to Land of the Southern Slavs, Yugoslavia had only been a single unified country since the end of the First World War, and had been ruled under the Serbian crown until 1941, when the German army invaded, seeking to secure their southern flank as well as gain a direct route to Greece to support their Italian efforts and occupation there. The royalist government fled and formed a government in exile led by Ivan Subasic, while the resistance in Yugoslavia itself was dominated by the communist-dominated pan-Slavic forces under the control of Josip Broz Tito. These partisans waged a highly successful guerrilla war, and by 1944, it was necessary to form a provisional government to run the territory they controlled, and anticipated controlling as the German occupation broke down. The June 16th Treaty of Vis formalized a merger between Tito's communists and Subasic's government in exile, and the Provisional Assembly was formed in November of that year, with Tito at the head and Subasic becoming the foreign minister. The assembly, based on the agreement made between Tito and Subasic, was to be a multi-party body pledged to uphold such things as democratic freedom and personal freedoms, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. These were seen as key in maintaining balance in the multi-ethnic state. By the end of April 1945, Yugoslavia was completely free of Axis forces and had even participated in the capture of some Italian and Austrian territory. Parliamentary elections were organized for and held in November of that year, and the communists came back with a huge result. The communist-dominated National Front took more than 90% of the vote and every single seat in the parliament. Of course, this phenomenal result should be qualified, as the opposition forces boycotted the election, citing the non-democratic environment in the pre-election period. This included barring enemies of the state from voting, the forced closure of opposition newspapers, and ongoing harassment of opposition members. On the 29th of November 1945, the monarchy was abolished and a one-party state, a People's Republic, was declared, uniting Bosnia, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. In the immediate post-war period, Tito pursued a good working relationship with the Soviet Union and introduced a centrally planned economy, albeit with some differences. While factories were nationalized, workers were entitled to a certain percentage of any profits. Small private enterprises with up to 4 employees were allowed, and in the agricultural sector, farmers were allowed to privately hold up to 10 hectares of land, with the rest being nationalized. Programs of rapid industrialization and reconstruction were launched, and as a result of massive volunteer work from the people, the results were highly successful. Yugoslavia was able to pursue a more independent course in the field of foreign relations when compared to other countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Hungary. Because Yugoslavia had been liberated by its own forces, and was dominated by a largely organic communist movement, the influence of the Soviet Union was more limited. At first, Tito pursued quite an aggressive anti-Western policy, while it looked to formalize its claim over the Istrian Peninsula, including the city of Trieste, which it had liberated from Axis control by the end of the war. The tensions over these claims came to a head in August of 1946, when Yugoslavian forces shot down 2 American aircraft. Although the situation was eventually resolved, tensions continued until 1947, when the Free Territory of Trieste was created under UN protection, with one zone under joint US and British administration, and the other zone under the control of the Yugoslav People's Army. The status of Trieste wasn't finalized until agreements in 1954, and then finally by treaty in 1975, when the city was divided between Italy and Yugoslavia. Tito pursued an active foreign policy for Yugoslavia and demonstrated an ambition to project his influence into other countries. Yugoslavia was the main sponsor for the Greek leftist forces during the Greek Civil War. The Greek communists, with their ties to Moscow, were eventually defeated in Greece when they refused continued Yugoslav support after the relationship between Stalin and Tito deteriorated in the late 1940s. Albania was effectively a Yugoslav satellite state, and Belgrade played a huge role in the governance of the country. Not only were joint Yugoslav-Albanian companies established, but the general direction of the entire Albanian economy was heavily influenced by Tito. There were also claims made by Tirana that Yugoslavia heavily exploited the resources available in the nation. The Yugoslav influence on its neighboring countries was strong enough that at one point there were even talks undertaken to include both Albania and Bulgaria into the Yugoslav Republic as equal federal republics. When Moscow found out about these talks, representatives from both Bulgaria and Serbia were called to Moscow and reprimanded for the negotiations. The Soviet Union wasn't actually opposed to the unification, they just didn't like not being consulted. Ultimately, the unification plans fell through as the Bulgarian delegation acquiesced to the Soviet position. The Soviet Union, viewing Yugoslavia as a satellite state, were unhappy with Tito. They were opposed to Yugoslavia's maneuvering to become a major regional power in southeastern Europe. These tensions escalated in the lead up to the second meeting of the Common Forum, the International Forum for Communist Parties around the world, and the spiritual successor to the pre-war Comintern. In an exchange of letters between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, the Soviet leveled accusations that the Yugoslav Communist Party was not sufficiently revolutionary, that it was betraying the class struggle, and of diminishing the role of the Red Army in saving Yugoslavia from the German occupation. The Yugoslavs rejected these accusations, and for their reward, the Yugoslav Communist Party was expelled from the Common Forum. What followed was a purge in Yugoslavia of anyone who had been in favor of Soviet leadership. What also followed in the other Soviet satellite states was a purge of the so-called Titoites, those that supported Tito's more liberal form of communist rule. As Yugoslavian relations with the socialist bloc deteriorated, it did somewhat improve with nations in the West, with economic aid being sent to help improve the economic conditions of the nation. This aid likely even helped prevent a famine occurring in 1950. Yugoslavia was also receiving shipments of US arms in this period, until Tito began to worry about excessive reliance on the West for military aid. The nation began to develop its own military arms industry, and even rejected an offer from the West to join the NATO military alliance. In general, the fallout with the Soviet Union pushed Yugoslavia to change. While Yugoslavia had always been far from a copycat, even in the early post-war years, the differences after the confrontation became more significant. The role and power of workers when compared to that of the state or the party was more prominent than it was in the Soviet Union. For example, the workers' councils in Yugoslavia had more direct control over the profits made than workers' councils in the Soviet Union. Both the state and party apparatus was smaller than in the Soviet Union, and notably, while the security apparatus was still a much feared tool of Tito, it was considered to be more mild than in other socialist bloc nations. Importantly, Yugoslavia chose to remain neutral during the Cold War and was one of the founders of the Non-Aligned movement, proclaiming peace and security as one of its ultimate aims. So this now leaves Albania to discuss. Like Yugoslavia, Albania liberated itself via a communist-led partisan movement. It had been under direct Italian rule since 1939, followed by German military occupation in 1943. However, by November of 1944, Axis forces had been expelled from the country, and a provisional government, headed by the communist Enver Hoxha, had been formed. The new government began a campaign of persecution against so-called war criminals and collaborators, although it's highly likely that included in those persecuted were people who opposed the communist movement in Albania. These persecutions, which included forced labor and even murder, were handled by the Ministry of the Interior, led by Koçi Zodza. Parliamentary elections were held in December of 1945, and the Communists won by a landslide, capturing all available seats. Not only did the Communists enjoy popular support from their victory against the Axis forces, and from land reforms that they had passed, but the political atmosphere in the country was not one friendly to opposition groups, for reasons we just talked about. The power of the Communists was further consolidated as Hoxha became the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Hoxha's second-in-command, Zhodze, remained the head of the Interior Ministry, as well as the Communist Party's organizational secretary. Moderates who were in favor of a less repressive regime, as well as closer contacts with the West, were purged and the monarchy was formally abolished in 1946. The communist hold on power was further consolidated. Economically, the nation was already being transformed in 1944 as the Provisional Communist Government began enacting changes. The property of all collaborators and political exiles was confiscated by the state. Selected industries, including transportation, was nationalized. By 1946, however, the pace of transformation had increased. All industry in Albania was nationalized and all foreign trade, as well as the majority of domestic trade, was brought under government control. Land reforms, as I mentioned earlier, were also being implemented. About half of the arable land in the country was redistributed and land was confiscated from anyone who did not depend on agriculture for their livelihood. This included absentee landlords deemed enemies of the state. All agricultural debts were annulled and large landowners were forced to give up the majority of their holdings. Albania's position in the international community was, shall we say, peculiar. The country was heavily under the sway of its much larger neighbor, Yugoslavia, and although a socialist nation, was considered quite unimportant by the Soviet Union. So unimportant, in fact, that Stalin once told the Yugoslav leadership that they should just swallow Albania. Yugoslavia, for its part, took advantage of its relations with the small nation, including treaties being signed to further the economic and monetary integration of the two. As we discussed earlier, joint Yugoslav-Albanian companies were formed in the areas of mining, railroad construction, oil, and electricity, as well as international trade. Numerous factory projects were built as a result of these joint companies, including a sugar refinery, a hemp factory, and a fish cannery, as well as general infrastructure projects, such as a telephone exchange being built in Tirana. Yugoslavia, in an effort to bolster the Albanian economy, was paying up to 3 times the market price for Albanian copper, as well as other raw goods. Despite this, the Albanian government still felt that Yugoslavia was taking advantage of them, and that they were being exploited by the Yugoslav government. They felt that too much pressure was being put on them to focus on resource extraction and agriculture. These feelings divided the Albanian government, with Prime Minister Hoxha and the head of the State Planning Commission, Nako Spiru, being against Yugoslav influence, while the Minister of the Interior, Zhodze, was in favor of it. Yugoslavia, in the meantime, had sent hundreds of advisors into Albania to help reform government structures, as well as the military. By 1947, some anti-Yugoslav communists had even been arrested on charges of treason, with the Yugoslav Communist Party accusing Hoxha of anti-Yugoslav sentiment. Hoxha, as a result, was close to losing power due to the huge influence that Tito and his communists held over Albania. After all, in 1947, more than half of the Albanian budget was made up of loans and support provided by Yugoslavia. The expulsion of Yugoslavia from the Common Forum, however, changed the situation dramatically. In the wake of the expulsion, Tirana gave those Yugoslav advisors 48 hours to leave the country, it rescinded all bilateral economic agreements with Yugoslavia, and began a virulent anti-Yugoslav propaganda campaign. A purge was also begun inside the Albanian Communist Party to remove Yugoslav sentiment. This included almost half of the Central Committee, 32 MPs, and of course, Minister of the Interior, Zhodze. With the removal of Yugoslav influence, Albania then turned to the Soviet Union for support. Hoxha began to implement more Stalinist policies, including collectivization and rapid industrialization by means of 5-year plans. The lack of a common border, however, as well as general Soviet disinterest, allowed Albania and Hoxha a degree of independence not enjoyed by other socialist bloc nations. So, as you can see, both Albania and Yugoslavia experienced a somewhat different trajectory in the establishment of socialist governments compared to other Eastern Bloc countries. Both had strained relationships with the Soviet Union, with Yugoslavia going so far as to declare itself not only neutral, but to found the non-aligned movement. Albania, always an outsider, found itself a client state of Yugoslavia, and then the Soviet Union, and then eventually China. But we're going to discuss that in future episodes, so please make sure to hit the bell button to subscribe. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and we will catch you on the next one.